Welcome to the Ending Sexploitation podcast, where we decode sexual harm and provide you with active solutions. I'm your host, Haley McNamara. Hello, everyone. This is going to be an amazing episode. I'm so excited to be joined by my wonderful colleague, Dani Pinter, Senior Vice President and Director of the NCOSE Law Center. Hey, Dani.
Hey, Haley. I'm so excited to talk Dirty Dozen today.
Me too. It is the launch. That if you're listening, it has launched the 2025 Dirty Dozen list. But there is I would call it historic twist this year to this campaign. But before we discuss that twist, maybe we can reflect a bit on what the Dirty Dozen list even is, its history, and why we've made a change this year. And Tim, if you could pull up the image of Dirty Dozen list, this is what people are used to seeing. This was our 2024 Dirty Dozen list. Dani, could you just maybe talk a little bit about what the Dirty Dozen list is?
Sure. So, the Dirty Dozen list is our big campaign to call out the mainstream facilitators of sexual exploitation. So, we, of course, are advocating all year round for companies to make safer choices. But when they don't listen, despite repeated warnings, this is our time to really highlight those problems. And particularly that, we've told these companies exactly how they can make their products safer, that other advocates and users have told them and have asked them to make these changes, and that they're just refusing to do that.
And something that I really have loved about the Dirty Dozen list is it gives individuals a way to take action. We have a direct line of connection between your everyday citizen who really cares about abuse, whether that's the issue of childhood pornography exposure, image-based sexual abuse, sex trafficking, or grooming happening typically online, although we've also had brick and mortar companies like Hilton Hotels and Walmart and others on there. But we give people a way to take action and get involved. So a way to send an email, speak out on social media, draft messaging, etc. And I think to me, that's a big point of power for the Dirty Dozen list. It's really helped us get results. And I think we could look even now at a blog that we have that re- just reflects on some of the really historic victories that we've had over the years. I don't know, Dani, if there's any victories from the Dirty Dozen list that have stood out to you over time.
Well, I wanted to ask you too, like, what year is this? How many years have we been doing the Dirty Dozen?
We've been going since 2013. It's been going on for a really long time. And every year we are seeing victories and results from it. So Instagram, used to allow strangers on Instagram to direct message minors, people who had no connections to kids. And we met with sex trafficking survivors who that was the way that they were first contacted and groomed for abuse. And because of Instagram being put on the Dirty Dozen list and individuals, like I said, taking action, sending emails, tweeting at Instagram, they changed it and made it so that adult strangers can no longer contact kids on Instagram, which is amazing. And then we were able to roll that into conversations with TikTok, and we got TikTok to make it so that 16-year-olds under 16 are not able to have direct messages as well. So that it is just one way that it helps remove access for predators to contact and groom kids online. So to me, those are some of my favorite victories. I don't know if there have been any that have stood out to you.
Well, the one I always think of is, and I don't know if this happened. You have to remind me, Haley, if this happened, immediately after our launch or shortly after. But when Google finally decided to default their devices to kids to safety. I mean, we have been
Yeah.
talking to them about that and asking for that forever. I know it probably showed up in more than one Dirty Dozen list campaign. And then, but we were able to really get their attention during the pandemic when they're issuing all these devices to these schools. Now there was almost going to be a tablet in every child's hand. And in that moment, we said, these have to be safe. You got to be kidding me. These schools are not prepared for this, and these parents are not prepared for this. And you know exactly what you could do to make them safe, Google. And then they did. And it was such a powerful moment too, because it showed how something that we'd asked forever and been ignored, and they act like they can't do anything. But in reality, when they wanted to, it was like a switch, right? Like just
Mhm.
instantly, all of these tablets and computers that are going to schools would now be defaulted to safety. Like that was so powerful to me too, because it shows like they can do this.
Yes, so, so true. Yeah. The change is possible. They just don't hear often from people and realize that there is consumer demand for safety and for the
Yeah.
internet to be a safer place. So I love the Dirty Dozen list. It's so impactful. Like I said, I mean, we've had probably close to 100 policy changes that we could tie to Dirty Dozen list activities. Google, Instagram, TikTok, Hilton, Walmart, um, Cosmopolitan, so many. But still, this progress, it's not been fast enough. I think something that I really love about working at NCOSE is that we're aggressive about trying to end sexual exploitation and abuse. We're not comfortable with appeasement or with minuscule progress. We want mass scale prevention, action at the highest levels, because, like you said, so often these changes could actually be done with basically a switch a
Yeah.
flip of a switch, and especially in the online space. What do you think, Danny, about just the state of abuse online? I think a lot of people would imagine it has to be getting better because, well, hey, we've got AI now. Shouldn't it be getting better?
Yeah, I don't think it's getting better. I mean, I think to AI in particular, we don't even know fully what those effects are, but we're seeing, you know, the bad side of it too, right? There's some great and wonderful uses, really incredible things that AI can do to make our lives easier and better. But on the flip side, it can also make some really terrible things easier for bad intentioned individuals. What's coming to mind to me is the use of AI in revenge porn or even child sexual abuse material, CSAM, and like the Nudify apps, and how quickly someone could take even an innocent picture of a child and turn it into something nefarious. So, I think the internet, the problem is we have section 230, which I know we're going to talk about today, but the problem is we really don't have any guardrails or any regulations or even any ability to hold internet actors accountable. And so for that
Mhm.
reason, as it progresses and more things are more innovation, hand in hand with that, unfortunately, is we're seeing more exploitation. And even just the stats are alarming of how massively sexual exploitation exploded online over the past 2 decades. So I think we're at this crossroads now where we have an internet bigger than ever and run by actors bigger than ever, and it's time to not be treating them with kid gloves.
Mm.
Now's the time, I think, in my opinion, to actually take safety really seriously and talk about how can we use innovation to create safe tools to keep kids safe, to design with responsibility. We don't need to move past fast and break things anymore. Now we need to be responsible online, in my opinion.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you mentioned that there's some really awful stats, and we'll just quickly go through. We've got two. I know one is a report from Thorn that we could pull up and look at. And if you could even zoom in on some of these numbers that are on the left-hand side, one of these numbers is that 1 in 4 kids online, this is a really recent report out of Thorn, 1 in 4 reports having a sexual interaction with another minor, and 1 in 4, that same amount, reports online sexual interactions with adults. 1 in 4 kids thinks that they have had an online sexual interaction with an adult, let alone how many more don't realize that it might be with an adult. So often we know that these predators can pose as kids. That stat just, it makes me so mad because I would think that, like you said, the internet is not new. These companies are gathering so much data about us. They know so much. They're taking down copyright material. They're tracking
Yeah.
everything that's happening on their platforms. And 1 in 4 kids is having an online sexual interaction with an adult. It's just completely unacceptable.
Yeah, exactly. And the real way we need to look at this is about incentives. When there is
Mm,
no means to hold websites accountable at all for any of their behavior, they have no incentive to build in safety. They just have no incentive. It costs money to innovate for safety, which there's an argument that having a safe product is itself, a good feature to offer that could, in the long run make you profitable. But the reality is that safety in itself is not a feature you monetize. That's not directly putting money in your pocket. So to have to spend money on something that's not going to make you money. And then on top of that, if 1 in 4 children are having interaction with adults, those are interactions. So if you're limiting those interactions, that's losing you money. So
mm,
in the end, we really need to think about this. We need to zoom out and not think about the platform policing each individual user. It's not that. It's about having them have a broader perspective of thinking about safety on their platform, accounting for safety, studying if their products are safe and fixing areas when they find out they know it's not safe or they're contributing to harm, like any business or any product would. When we think about car manufacturers, we don't think about them policing each of us in our cars. We think about them designing that product and that car with the information they have, knowing what things are safe or not safe and accounting for those things. And, they're not sitting there thinking so much about, I mean, of course they're factoring in the cost, but they're weighing that against liability. They
mm.
know that if they could be sued for this, that's going to cost them way more money than it would to make the product safe. And so we need to change those incentives all around. And that's how we're really going to get mass scale change that moves the needle on those numbers. And it's not about, digging and spying on us and policing each individual user. It's about at the big picture level, making their product safe.
And I'm so glad you said that. I think that that leads us perfectly into what the Dirty Dozen list is this year, which as I said, it has launched. You can go to see it yourself at dirtydozenlist.com. But all of this conversation, I think, leads up to this point of why we've decided to have a twist on the list this year, is because people have been advocating and organizing. We have been advocating and organizing for over a decade, and we've been getting results, but they are piecemeal. They're not fast enough.
Yeah.
Abuse is only increasing online. It's not getting better, even though the technology companies have more money, more insights, more data than ever. It's the problem is getting worse. And so that is why this year for the Dirty Dozen list, instead of focusing on 12 mainstream companies, we are focusing on one call to action. And that one call to action is to repeal Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And this is really what we need to do to change the ecosystem online, um, from the start, from the level of incentives.
Can I tell, maybe our audience doesn't even know what Section 230 is?
Yeah, let's talk about it.
Yeah, so Section 230 is referring to a federal law. So it's Communications Decency Act, Section 230, 47 USC Section 230, if you want to know, and be a law nerd like I am. But this was a federal law that was passed back in 1996. And the irony is it's called the Communications Decency Act because Congress was moved to actually account for making kids safe online already in 1996. Congress was hearing from
Mm.
constituents that kids are being exposed to explicit content, being contacted by adults in chat rooms and those kinds of things. So Congress was actually taking action then at the very beginning of the internet. But at that time, there had just come out a case in New York that held a website accountable for defamation of, like a third party user posted something on the website and the website was held accountable for that because it was somewhat moderating posts. And, that's probably wasn't the right decision. It was like this one small court case, but the tech company was armed with that case to say, if you do this and you prohibit, the For example, I think the original law prohibited sending sexually explicit material to minors or sending obscenity to minors. If you do that, then every platform will either be sued because of all the bad actors on their site, or they won't moderate because they'll be afraid that if they moderate, that will make them liable, or they just won't exist. Like it won't be worth going into business because they'll be so afraid of this law. And so, due to all those arguments, Congress tried to strike a balance with Section 230. That was like the compromise, the tech industry. And it's actually called the Good Samaritan provision. It was meant, ironically, to incentivize platforms to moderate, to be good digital Samaritans, and in exchange, essentially, they would be immune from liability. And in a nutshell, it says, platforms will not be treated as, the publishers in the same shoes as a third party that published on their site. That seems very common sense, but unfortunately, the way that courts have interpreted that over the past 20 years has been way broader even than Congress intended. It's turned into essentially blanket immunity for any website, any web platform, for anything that a third party does. But it even gets interpreted beyond what a third party does to be anything that their platform does that facilitates third party content. And even recently, there's a recent case against the dating platform Grindr, where the Ninth Circuit found that even Grindr's own tool, which matched people that ended up matching this adult predator with a child. I mean, Grindr designed that tool. That's not something third parties did. Of course, third parties are ultimately matched, but Grindr's own tool was immunized under Section 230. So that's just even a recent example. As far as we've come, and as far as many people, including us, have complained about 230, still those are the kinds of decisions. And that's, going back to what I was talking about, incentives. I think that's what's created the very dangerous place that is the internet today.
Absolutely. And it's so fascinating because, like you said, it's this blanket immunity that's been interpreted that way by the courts. And even in cases where the the company has knowledge of
Yeah.
exploitation or abuse that's happening on its platform, let alone if they're being reckless or negligent. As a non-lawyer, I would imagine, I mean, any company can't be reckless or negligent. And if they are, they can be sued, and correctly so. And then the courts figure it out. But for some reason, this law has been allowed to really shut survivors out of the courts. And like you said, that's happening right now with this recent Grindr case. It happened back during Backpage, which, for those who have been with us for a long time, they'll remember Backpage was essentially a Craigslist of sex trafficking. It was eventually shut down by the Department of Justice, but because they were so blatant in their facilitation, I would argue, many argued, knowing facilitation of sex trafficking and prostitution advertisements online. And that's where they made over 90% of their money. And even in that case, which is so, to me, so black and white, survivors weren't able to win civil litigation.
One of the worst cases was a case out of, I think, New York. And the court said, even if Backpage knew that their platform was facilitating sex trafficking, essentially, Section 230 immunizes them. To your point, it's just that can't be the legal regime that we as Americans are okay with anymore, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's real people in these cases who have had traumatic abuse. I mean, this
Yeah.
year, the Dirty Dozen list, we usually are focused on 12 companies. This year, we're trying to go to that higher level by focusing on one action of we need to change Section 230 in order to impact hundreds, thousands of companies at one
Yeah.
time. But instead of focusing on 12 companies, we are going to be elevating 12 stories of real life cases of survivors who were essentially denied justice in the court system because of CDA 230. One of those stories was an 11-year-old girl who was placed in a chat room with a predator by Omegle, which some of you may know was kind of a video chat platform that's now defunct. But Omegle placed her in this chat room with a predator who then abused her, threatened her, extorted her, even as she was pleading for it to stop. She was 11 years old. And Omegle put her in that chat room and with an adult, and her case wasn't allowed to go forward because of CDA 230. And not only is that so traumatizing for that 11-year-old, but just the precedents are stacking up, and that impacts so many other people.
Well, and why would any, I mean, why would any platform stop, continuing to facilitate that kind of thing when they see that? I mean, they can never, that's what think people really need to understand. Um, I think Omegle arguably was a really knowing bad actor, like Backpage. There's a lot of evidence that they knew their site was like a favorite of predators. And that's a little different than maybe a social media platform being reckless, like you said. But at the end of the day, if you know that your tool is used by both good people and bad people, it's making you this unbelievable amount of money. And if you become aware of situations like this 11-year-old where your platform is doing harm to kids, but to fix that, I mean, you would greatly reduce your profit margin. I mean, you're just not going to do it. No
Mhm.
company is going to do it. They're not in the business of being good people. They're in the business of making money, and that's not going to be an equation that ever works out for the good of society. Unfortunately, I think that's just the practical reality we have to face, is that hoping that these platforms are altruistic and make choices to lose money to keep your kids safe is really a pipe dream. I just think we have to like let go of that. It's not going to happen. Unfortunately, we thought that, as often is the case, that maybe just public attention, public call out, bad press, bad PR would be enough to motivate these platforms, because we've seen that work many times. And even with the Dirty Dozen, particularly, that's a method we use of, like you said earlier in this conversation, sometimes these companies don't know that customers are upset about something. And then once they hear it, they change because they want their customers to be happy. But with social media, where it's so addicting, it's so ubiquitous, people are not going to stop using these platforms. It doesn't matter. They're not going to stop one bit. And we brought last year, what was it, January 28th of last year, we helped facilitate a big hearing at Congress. I mean, Congress has been hearing from their constituents forever about these horror stories about kids being terribly abused. We have our client who was 13 when he was sextorted on Snapchat. That ends up on Twitter. Twitter says we reviewed it and we're not taking it down. That Twitter was held immune. They could not be sued for that
Mhm.
behavior. That was knowing possession of child pornography. We've been talking about these things. Congress held a big hearing specifically on this, subpoenaed the four largest tech companies, right? Or maybe even more than four. It was TikTok CEO is there, Snapchat CEO is there, Meta was there, and Twitter, right? And Twitter's CEO, I
Mhm.
think, was there at the time. And they were all there, and they had to answer to Congress. And we brought the parents and the family members of these kids who had literally died. There was dozens of parents holding up pictures of their kids who were dead because of
Mm.
harms that these platforms had known about. Like in Meta's case, we had two different whistleblowers coming forward saying Meta absolutely knew that their products were addictive to kids and were causing them terrible harm, and they made an active choice to let that go on rather than fix it. We were proffering solutions that they rejected. You had, Zuckerberg turning around and apologizing to the parents. Did we see some radical change after that? I mean, that was a historic moment. It was a historic moment, and I think ultimately it will matter. But the truth is, as bad a press as that could have been, the tech industries, I mean, they just took it on the chin and
Mm.
and kept on keeping on. And we see that with Zuckerberg's then, announcement this year, acting like he cares about free speech, but he throws in there while he's cutting moderation, including for child exploitation. I mean, that was cut right along with his supposed free speech measures.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, and that's different. It's a different thing. Free speech is different than criminal activity. And I think that,
Exactly.
and And like you said, I mean, these companies, unfortunately, they're not altruistic, and we've tried to appeal to their better nature. Many people who work in those companies care about these issues. But like you said, the whistleblowers on Meta, Snapchat had some documents that came out that showed that they were systemically and regularly ignoring internal reports of sextortion. Also, TikTok recently, there was a case where some things got shared about how TikTok had internal reports acknowledging that their platform incentivized live videos where there
Oh,
is sexual content and in exchange for gifts, in exchange for money, and that they recognized internally that their algorithms were supporting that even in cases of children being
children.
solicited essentially for sexual acts. This shows too how change is possible if the companies took action, if they were incentivized to take those reports seriously, to not allow their algorithms to promote that kind of thing, that if they discover it, they would fix it instead of this just continuing on for years until it gets leaked because of a lawsuit. And actually, Tim, if you could pull up the lobby numbers that I have, big tech is so not altruistic in these things. They're actually lobbying against regulation. And I think that we have those numbers is something like $51 million that have been spent in 2024 by big tech to lobby Congress. And what they're talking about is that they don't want to be regulated. They want to be
Yeah,
this
nothing.
magical industry that has no regulations, which, I mean, what other industry, Danny, as a lawyer, what
None.
other
No.
industry has that kind of a deal?
No one enjoys that kind of government protection. I mean, maybe there's this small carve out for like medical research sometimes. I think, I don't even want to get into it, but like vaccines and things like when the government wants something done quickly, but not an entire industry. Nowhere in this country does entire industry get this artificial government protection through the immunity, saying private citizens, you can't be touched. Private citizens can't even bring their case. I mean, ultimately, in some of these cases, maybe the platform wouldn't be liable. I mean, they would get to put on their
Mhm.
case and go through discovery. And it may be that it turns out they really didn't know enough about this or couldn't have done much about it. And fine. But I mean, right now, no one can even bring their case. They can't even be heard in court because the government is saying they're immune. And then on top of lobbying to prevent any change to that immunity, they're lobbying to prevent any regulation. And that's what Congress has kind of really shown some frustration. They said, you don't want us to touch immunity, but then you push back against any government regulation either. You don't want to be accountable to the people, your customers, and you don't want to be accountable to the government. That has never been seen before, except maybe in those bad examples of way back in our day when have we had monopolies and things like that. And I don't think that's a
Mhm.
place we want to return to, where you have massive companies actually running things. Like, no, they need to be accountable to the people.
Absolutely. The thing that is positive, at least, because this is a kind of a grim picture. We've got these powerful companies spending millions of dollars. They don't have, like you said, any accountability. But I do think that progress is possible. There's a reason that this year we are focused on calls to repeal Section 230, and it's because there is growing bipartisan support for this
Support.
concept. What have you seen, Danny, in that? I know they recently held a hearing. There were quotes. I actually have some quotes here that I can just read off. One by
Yeah, do that.
Holly. Okay, so this is bipartisan again. So I'll go Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat. Holly said, until Congress gives parents the ability to sue, nothing will change. These companies don't care about fines and they don't care about regulations. Klobuchar said, instead of reaching some reasonable accommodations or settlements, we just let them run wild at the expense of our kids' lives. Blackburn said nothing much has changed since the hearing last year with big tech CEOs. It is only in the virtual space that it remains the Wild West. And then Durbin said this bill will finally open the courthouse doors. What are your thoughts to that, Danny?
Yeah, I think it reflects that there's really a will. So there's a political will here, as much as these tech companies, which is incredible actually to think about because you gave that number. I think 50 million, these tens of millions of lobbying dollars, and yet, that's going into Congress's pocket, and yet Congress is upset. And when they, you know, say things like this publicly, they're asking their constituents to back them up. They're asking the public to back them up. So this is such a unique opportunity where we can all use our voices and it will make a difference. We need to support our congresspeople, give them the courage to stand up to tech that is trying to literally douse them with dollars so that they don't do the difficult thing. So that's why we have such a great opportunity with Section 230. And one other thing I was thinking about too, and thinking about those dollars and like the positive side of things is, tech always spins this doom and gloom, and that if you change 230 or if we're held accountable in some way, then it's going to be the dark ages again, and you're going to stifle innovation or disrupt everyone's privacy. But they're spending $50 million to keep the status quo. What if they spent those dollars innovating on safety solutions? I mean, think of the things that they are innovating and that they are creating. I mean, there's some incredible technology, yet none of that is dedicated solely to like protecting kids online, keeping them safe. I mean, it would completely flip the script where if they actually start investing in safety, they could probably come up with some
Mm.
incredible tools where kids could travel online with these tools that actually kept them safe. I mean, I can't even envision what that would look like because we've done nothing in terms of innovation on safety. So I think there's this wide open ocean of new innovation that would come with a change of incentives. When right now it's sort of like the worst common denominator, right? Like all the innovation is towards getting a customer early and keeping them. I mean, that's grim. Is that
Mm.
the kind of
Mhm.
innovation we want to keep supporting rather than maybe things that enrich people's life and make them safer? And on the other side of that, and the privacy argument, it's just such a false narrative when these tech companies are mining us for data. They're taking every little bit of our private lives and using it for their commercial use. So whenever they bring up privacy, I think that that's so sick.
Yes. This actually leads perfectly in, Danny. I was wondering if you'd be willing to do a quick fire Q&A. You're a
Sure.
lawyer. If I could just ask you a couple quick fire, kind of like frequently asked questions or devil's advocate questions of concerns that people have around the
Yeah.
idea of repealing CDA 230. Number one, do you think that that would hurt free speech online?
No, I don't think I think if anything, it would improve free speech because right now, free speech, when we think about the First Amendment, what does that mean? It means the government cannot impede or silence on people's speech. It doesn't mean other private individuals can't silence you, right? And I think maybe there are circumstances like, for example, um, you know, you do something like a lawsuit literally to silence someone, then there's some laws that are like, well, you're using the court system, which is like a government intermediary to silence. But people think that they talk about free speech a lot with like social media. But the truth is, those social media companies can do whatever they want. They can silence and censor you however they please, and they can control the narrative however they please. The Supreme Court recently ruled that if they have an algorithm that serves you up content, I mean, that's their own free speech. So, what we have right now is actually tech companies controlling our narratives, tech companies picking and choosing what can be on their site with no accountability. And we see that sometimes with this like selective censoring of different ideas. And honestly, the tech companies can do that legally. I mean, they can do whatever they want. It's like if you went into their store, you went into someone's house, they're in charge of their domain. They're not the government. So it's like liability in itself, it creates an incentive to avoid being sued. So now I don't think
Mm.
that we want a bunch of defamation lawsuits. And like certainly I think keeping them out of defamation makes sense. But at the same time, prohibiting, the distribution of child pornography, which is not protected speech, prohibiting criminal conduct, like the grooming of a child, the sexual
Mhm.
exploitation of a child, the sex trafficking of a child, that's conduct. If you couldn't do that in a park, could be an adult grooming a child in a park, then you shouldn't be able to do that online. It really has nothing to do with speech. And
Mhm.
I hope people can understand that like pedophiles have been making free speech arguments since the beginning. Like this isn't new. Grooming laws, or even, whenever like predators want to provide pornography to children or talk to children about sex, they've always said they have a free speech right to do that, and they've just never been successful. So we don't want to allow that kind of narrative to work here. There's sort of this fake argument they make that if platforms are liable, somehow that means your free speech will be at risk. I honestly I don't see the connection at all,
Yeah. We still have the
because
First Amendment.
we still have the First Amendment. It's complete independent. So if they did something that did silence you in a way that violated the First Amendment, you would have remedy. They wouldn't be allowed to do that. And so it doesn't, that's what there's just really no
Mhm.
real connection. And right now,
Mhm.
there's already a threat to free speech in the way that they manipulate our speech
Mm.
freely right now.
Another question is, would this lead to frivolous lawsuits that would just completely overwhelm tech companies?
Well, it's impossible to say they would overwhelm tech companies right now, which are the biggest, richest, and most powerful companies in the world. So if your regular old company has to deal with liability, certainly we should start worrying that tech companies can't handle liability. I mean, that's complete and utter nonsense. But if we're thinking about, oh, the theoretical startup could be crushed, no, I don't think that's true. Of course, there's a risk that a frivolous lawsuit can come, but the reality is there's already remedies for that. There's Rule 11 remedies for frivolous lawsuits, and likely this would be federal. So, certainly lawsuits can bankrupt somebody even if they don't end up going anywhere. I mean, that's absolutely true. That can be abusive, but that usually happens at a very like local, state level where there's not really uniform rules. There's a little less predictability. But the internet, it seems pretty clear. I wouldn't say this issue is decided, but it's pretty clear that most remedies would have to be federal, and there's just a lot more consistency across the federal courts. So and stronger one, it's really hard to bring a lawsuit honestly in federal court. The standard for that lawsuit is it's really higher than it is in other state courts to meet. Like, you have to allege from the outset that you have a claim and really back it up, and if you don't, a lot of cases are dismissed. So even in, like, we try to bring sex trafficking cases against hotels, for example, and there's no Section 230 immunity involved, and they still often get dismissed. Like, it's difficult to show from the beginning that you have met the standard of even the first step of showing that maybe this hotel could be liable. And it will be I think it'll be the same thing here, that you're going to have to really back up your claims and plead them well to just get over that federal hurdle. So no, I
Mhm.
don't think the likelihood of masses of frivolous lawsuits crushing the industry is realistic at all. I think that's nonsense.
And last question is, this is a bit of a legal nerd question, so I don't know if everyone will have been following, but if you've been following NCOSE for a long time, you've heard us talk about CDA 230, Section 230 before, when we were advocating for FOSTA SESTA, which is a law that was passed back in 2018. And as I understand it, Danny, feel free to expand on this, but it did attempt to make some amendment to CDA 230
Yeah.
blanket immunity, saying that a website could be held liable if they're knowingly facilitating the sex trade, sex trafficking, and prostitution. However, so someone might say, well, see, it's already fixed. What's your reaction to that?
So unfortunately, right, the thought was to protect 230, but Backpage, it really bore out of the outrage that we were talking about before. That Backpage could possibly be immune when basically their entire business model was facilitating sex traffickers and pimps. How could they be immune for that massive, uh, large scale harm they're causing, right? And so Congress was still having to deal with the tech industry's cries and moans and complaining about Section 230. So they said, "We're just going to make this narrow carve out. If you're a website that's knowingly facilitating sex trafficking, well, surely you're not going to be immune. 230 is not going to apply to you, and it never should have applied to you."
Mm.
But the problem is that small carve out and requiring that very high burden of knowingly, which means that the victim would have to show the website knew of her exploitation, which that's pre-discovery. I mean, we don't know on the back end what the platforms know, right? So being able to show that is really, really, really difficult. And so the result is survivors haven't succeeded under this theory. I don't think there's a single case. There may have been one or two Salesforce cases, but I don't think there's been any cases that have actually succeeded on through FOSTA. I mean, maybe some on some other theories they have gone around 230, like products liability, but actually a court saying, yes, you've met the FOSTA standard, and because you were sex trafficked and because this platform facilitates your sex trafficking, you can bring this claim. That hasn't happened. And the
Mm.
scary thing is, even when the survivors did show a lot of knowledge. Like, for example, in this Reddit case in the Ninth Circuit, there was, I think, about 10 minors whose child pornography was continuously being uploaded to Reddit. Sometimes they take it down, sometimes they wouldn't. It would come back, it would come back. So, I mean, they were aware because they were taking it
Mm.
down sometimes. And the Ninth Circuit said, no, that's not enough. You need to show that they're criminally liable. So then we bring a case on behalf of our clients of Twitter where we have the child. He specifically told the platform, I was 13 in this video. I was um, blackmailed and tricked essentially into making it. So describing sextortion, describing sex trafficking, describing child pornography, saying, please take this down. Then you actually have a Twitter employee saying, I've reviewed the material. So now they've reviewed child pornography. They've also seen all the engagement. We had over 100,000 views, I think over 160,000 views. So see how they are getting money from this post. And then saying, we are not taking it down. So you could prosecute Twitter under that theory, in my opinion. I mean, that's enough
Mm.
to at least argue that they were in knowing possession of child pornography. That's a crime. Nobody can be in knowing possession of child pornography. So surely that meets the Foster standard. But no, the district court said it didn't. And we're back up at the Ninth Circuit. But, after that Reddit decision and this Grinder decision, I hope they do the right thing and find, well, certainly this meets FOSTA, but it's looking like there's a very large chance that it wouldn't. And the federal district court said, no, that wasn't enough. So this is why we're calling for, and I think it
Mm.
dovetails into the Dirty Dozen list theme and ask. Many people may say, well, why are you saying repeal? That seems really extreme. And we're saying that because these tiny carve outs, like we see in FOSTA, it took monumental effort and resources, floods of survivors, survivor advocates, organizations, grassroots, a documentary, all these bad
Mhm.
cases to bring us to Congress and get to the finish line, and still tech ratcheted up that knowledge standard, and now it's essentially meaningless. I mean, I don't believe that. I
Mhm.
think there's still hope, but in practical reality, it was passed in 2018 and no survivor has been able to bring a case under it. What are we doing here?
Mhm.
I think the biggest thing is those carve outs are probably not enough, but the main thing is tech needs to stop getting a veto. They need to stop getting an automatic veto at the table. So our position is repeal, unless Congress can do something that's really meaningful reform that maybe doesn't put platforms on the hook for defamation. I don't think that does anybody any good. And I think if we keep sort of the status quo for defamation, that probably resolves the First Amendment concerns everyone has. Um, but other than that, they need to be responsible for the harms on their platforms. They should be able to run around being negligent and hurting people, just like no company
Mhm.
should. So without some real meaningful reform, our position is repeal, because truthfully, what happens is every time we provide a legislative solution, tech gets an automatic approve or disapprove. Well, guess what? They're never going to
Mhm.
approve of something that would be that would be really meaningful. Of course, they're going to
Mhm.
keep doing things to cut it or to make it unusable, like we see in FOSTA. So, yeah. So I
Yeah,
don't think
exactly.
FOSTA solved
No,
the problem.
the problem is not solved, and just like you said, that is why repeal is needed. That is why the Dirty Dozen list is solely focused this year on these 12 stories of survivors who were locked out of the courtrooms essentially because of CDA 230, Section 230. And so now is the time. So I would love to call on all those who are listening to learn more about this issue. Go to dirtydozenlist.com. Also, please share this episode, share dirtydozenlist.com with your friends. and contact legislators. We will have an easy action. It'll take like 2 clicks. We've drafted the content for you to call on your representatives and ask them to repeal CDA 230. We were talking earlier about some of the power of dirty dozen lists is that the companies sometimes need to feel the pressure of the consumer to make the right decision. That's really true in Congress too. And
Yeah.
there is growing support for it. But like I said, big tech is spending millions and millions of dollars lobbying against it. They're showing up in the offices, pounding pavement, knocking on doors, making it seem like nobody wants this, like nobody wants to change the status quo of how big tech is run. And so we need to give Congress the clarity that people want change and they want these platforms to have the incentive to have accountability, just like the automobile industry. Just make your seatbelts, make your airbags, and have some safety by design from the outset, and then you can be a thriving industry. But so that's the call to action, is to go to dirtydozenlist.com, take the action, share it. And Dani, any parting thoughts from you?
I mean, I think I would just echo that this is really your opportunity. Every individual, every parent, every child, everyone who I think every one of us are affected daily by tech. And so this is your opportunity to be a part of a movement, to be a part of a change, because truly every voice matters. And I want to highlight what you said, like Congress. I mean, when they get those calls, it really makes a difference. It really does. And at the end of the day, they're accountable to their constituents. So let's harness that power, power of the people, and take it back and do some real good here.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thanks for joining us in ending sexploitation.